Good evening. For those in my Sunday morning class, I guess I can turn this one off. Sister Tammy gave me a book this evening, and we were talking about this after class. I guess it was this past Sunday morning, right? I mentioned that we're going to do just a real brief overview of Between the Testaments. But this is a book that she'd asked me, did I know of any real good books on that? And I was thinking of one that I believe the last class I took studying that in an actual class type of setting or whatever was at the Chattanooga School of Preaching and Biblical Studies up at Greens Lake Road. And I was trying to think who taught that. Tom Harrison. He was preaching at the Central Church in Cleveland, Tennessee at that time. But the kind of the textbook he was using was Charles Pfeiffer's Between the Testaments. At that time, it wasn't in print, so you couldn't say, go out and get this, it's going to be really good. I guess somebody's brought it back into print, so that's awesome. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to diving into that. But one of the reasons that I thought about that and I liked it so much is because you can see it's not a super large book, so it's not going to take you forever to read it, especially if you're like me. But it is tiny font, Chris says. It is a little bit small font. But it's, there's so much that could be said about that time period historically. And that's what sometimes I've run across is some books, there's so much information it's just hard to process it all and get through it all. And then some books or pamphlets or whatever are so short that you don't feel like you get much information at all. And so I liked, he would give us a lot of material from Pfeiffer's book, and I liked it for that. And he even, he had a copy of it, and we could kind of look at his some. And I liked it for that because it's kind of it strikes a happy medium. So you may want to, but don't get mine. That one's mine. We left off in Matthew chapter 6. And we were talking about, we basically finished, we basically finished verse 18, the section on fasting. I was going to mention, got 2 or 3 different sets of notes here. I'm trying to combine everything and make sure I get what I wanted to cover. I may get some folks to read for me, and what I'll do is I will call out the passage. And Billy told me the other day, he said, I like it when you get folks to read scriptures in class and get different people to read. I said, okay, and of course, about that time, the new mic, we got a short in it or something, got to get another cord. And so I'm having to use this one. That's what I was going to use this one for, is to kind of pass around when people read or have a comment or a question or whatever. And so I hadn't done that in a little while, and I think it was Sunday, Billy said to me, he said, do you really want to? I really like to get some people reading in class. So I think Billy's sick of listening to me, is what it comes down to. So I'm going to oblige Billy tonight, and I'm going to have some folks do some reading. Sometimes I don't always get around to doing that. Sometimes it just, you're rushing through stuff, you don't even think about it. And other times, sometimes just for time's sake, I go ahead and read them, or especially if I know them by heart, I may just go ahead and quote them. But it is good for us to turn to these passages together. So for the sake of those on the live stream, I'll call out the verses and you can look at them so you'll at least know. You may not be able to hear whoever's reading perfectly, but you'll at least know where they're reading from and you can read along. That said, we were talking about fasting. This is a matter of fasting, it's a matter of Christian liberty. It's not something that is commanded and here's how you're going to carry this out. But at the same time, Jesus does say, when you fast. And so it seems like, as we pointed out last week, that he expected and expects that even under the new covenant, there is a place and a time for fasting. That said, I can't go to somebody and say, hey, you been fasting? How long are you fasting? Well, that's not long enough. What are you abstaining from? Well, you need to do better than that. It's a matter of Christian liberty. And numerous passages, but especially right here in Matthew 6, point that out because he says when you're fasting, people shouldn't even know. And so could be people right here tonight that are fasting. We don't know about it. We shouldn't know about it. You don't want to come in all puny and somebody says, well, what's wrong? Well, I'm fasting. I'm just trying to be more spiritual or whatever. Well, you know, Jesus, that's exactly what he's saying. Don't do. Don't do it for attention. Don't abuse it. You just look normal. Nobody should even know. It's between you and the Lord. But as I mentioned last week, there are a number of reasons why people may fast, and most of these come from my father-in-law's material. He's got some great material on the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, a couple of times last week was one of the examples where we covered 2 or 3 verses, because he just I was using a lot of his material last week as well, because he's got so much rich material on the entire Sermon on the Mount. But why might one choose to fast? Now this is where I'm going to say, let me just, who was willing to read? I'll start dishing out some verses here. All right, Brother Chris, Ezra 8, 21 through 23. Bob, Psalm 35, 13. Brother Martin, I lost my place. 1 Kings 21, 22 through 29. Oh, there's more. Brother Steve. That's not a double, is it? No. 2 Chronicles 20, 3 and 4. Brother Todd, Jonah 3, 5 through 10. And Brother Tim, Galatians 5, 22 and 23. Mike, 1 Corinthians 9, 27. And one more passage, for right now at least, Brother Mark, Acts 13. We're going to look at a few different verses from the first, we'll look at the first 3 verses. And then we'll look at a verse from Acts 14. Sorry, I have 2 more. Didn't realize that. 2 more. Blake, Colossians 3:15. Onamas. One more. Brother Jimmy, 1 Corinthians 7:5. I'll give those guys time to get to that. Oh, by the way, Billy sent me a message. It's a nice message. He just wanted me to let everybody know, whoever's driving I just lost it, white Ford EcoSport. If you're driving a white Ford EcoSport, you left your lights on. They may go off automatically. I don't know. Might be somebody downstairs. Maybe nobody wants to say I left my lights on. I don't know. All right. So, why might somebody choose to fast? Reason number 1, and this is what you see a lot in the Old Testament, is to humble or to afflict the soul, is the way the Old Testament often puts it. By the way, as I studied this, I had this question, I don't know, probably close to 10 years ago, maybe 10 years ago or more, at Childersburg. It was in a Q&A, and the question was something like, are Christians commanded to fast? And I answered the question. I said, no. And I went through it, and then later on, I studied it more and more, and I still maintain there's not a command, but I basically approached it from the standpoint of, and I was kind of saying it tongue-in-cheek, but also, answering the question, no, there's no command, and why would you? That's kind of the way I said it. But, as you study this, again, it does seem that Jesus expects that, and there is value to it. By the way, Wayne Jackson on ChristianCourier.com has a good article dealing with fasting if you want to do a little more research and study. But I began to look at this, and in fact, what I actually said in that Q&A, as I recall, is that fasting is not commanded under the New Testament, nor was it commanded under the Old Testament. And you don't see an actual statement in the Old Testament, but when you do some research, particularly on the Day of Atonement, there's a phrase. Does anybody know where I'm going with this? What that phrase is? There's a phrase that is used, ye shall afflict your souls. And that statement, when you do some research on the meaning of that phrase in the Hebrew language and in the Jewish culture, it was a command for them, at least on the Day of Atonement, I believe. I want to say there was maybe another occasion. But at least on that day, that was a command to fast. So that's the reason I say number one here, to humble or to afflict the soul. It's not just, kind of like you see this sometimes, maybe you've read about it in history, people monks and things like that, they'll go off and build a monastery, or nuns may go off and build a convent or something, and they just get as far away from people as they can, and sometimes they'll just afflict themselves physically and hurt themselves as if the flesh is inherently evil, and by punishing the flesh I somehow become more spiritual. It's not that, but it's the idea of humbling ourselves. Psalm 35:13. I think I got those out of order. Who had Psalm 35?
But as for me, when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I afflicted my soul with fasting, and my prayer returned into my own bosom.
Okay, the psalmist says, even his enemies, when they were sick, I put on sackcloth. That's an uncomfortable garment. Again, it's not just for the purpose of, I'm going to punish myself physically and that's going to make me more holy. It's every time you feel the discomfort, and in the context of fasting, every time you're hungry, you think about whatever you're focusing on. It may be spirituality in general, it may be growing closer to God, it may be, in some cases, sin that you're penitent for, and you're trying to, you want to work to get rid of that sin in your life. Ezra 8, who had that one? Ezra 8, 21 through 23, go ahead.
Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek from him the right way for us and our little ones and all our possessions. For I was ashamed to request of the king an escort of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy on the road, because we had spoken to the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all those for good who seek him, but his power and his wrath are against all those who forsake him. So we fasted and entreated our God for this, and he answered our prayer.
All right, so there's a good example. Is that New King James?
Yes.
New King James has, we humbled ourselves before God. The old King James has afflict ourselves. So that's the idea. But Ezra, he's told the king, God's going to take care of us. God's going to look out for us. He doesn't want to ask the king for soldiers, a guard, a detachment, whatever, because he feels like, we've told him God's going to look after us, and we don't want to be beholden to the king for protection. And so there's some concern there. So he says we're gonna fast, and every time they're hungry, they're thinking about that, and maybe every time they get hungry, maybe every time they feel the hunger, they say a prayer to God for his protection, for his deliverance, and safe travels, and so on. So again, there's another example. 1 Kings 21, 22 through 29. Is that you, Martin? Did you have that one?
1 Kings 21 verses what?
You can do 22 through 24, and then just drop to verse 27 and do 27 through 29. How about that? Yeah, and then going down to verse 27, do 27 through 29.
So it was when Ahab heard those words that he tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his body, and fasted and lay in the sackcloth and went about mourning. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, see how Ahab has humbled himself before me. Because he has humbled himself before me, I will bring calamity in his days. In the days of his son, I will bring calamity on his house.
God has some strong words for Ahab. And he says, Ahab, he was one of the most wicked kings in the northern kingdom. None of the kings in the north was a righteous man. But Ahab was kind of the worst of the worst. And so God says, I'm going to cut your entire household, talking about his lineage, off. Make it like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. That's exactly what God did to Jeroboam's lineage. And like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah, which the same thing happened to him. Even mentions Jezebel, and she's going to be, what's left of her is going to be eaten by wild dogs, be scavenger type animals, even the fowls of the air. But when Ahab hears these words, verse 27 says, he tears his clothes, a sign of mourning. He put sackcloth upon his flesh and fasted, and lay in sackcloth and went softly, as the King James puts it. He's treading lightly, we might say. And, the word of the Lord comes to Elijah and says, you see that? You see how Ahab's humbled himself? Because he's done that, I'm not going to bring the evil in his days, but in his son's days, this evil is coming. Because he fasted to humble, to afflict himself, that he might seek God's mercy. And in that instance, at least, of course, God is willing, ready, able to forgive. Unfortunately for Ahab, that's going to be short-lived, of course. So, to humble or to afflict the soul might be a reason when somebody fasts. It might be to put one in a better frame of mind to seek God, to seek God's will, to seek God's aid, to seek God's mercy. Chris read that for us there in Ezra 8:21. 2 Chronicles 20, verses 3 and 4 is another example. Who had that one? All right, Brother Steve.
And Jehoshaphat feared and set himself to seek the Lord, and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. So Judah gathered together to ask help from the Lord, and from all the cities of Judah they came to seek the Lord.
All right, so Jehoshaphat, he's fearing the Lord. He decides he's going to seek the Lord, and he proclaims a fast, not just for himself, but throughout all of the nation of Judah, to seek God's help. They needed God's help in a physical sense there through the battle, and so they're going to have a fast. A familiar passage, Jonah 3, 5 through 10. Who had that one? Is that Todd? Okay.
And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them to the least of them. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, bird nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way, from the violence that is in his hand. Who knows? God may turn and relent, and turn from his fierce anger, so that we may not perish. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it.
All right, so Jonah goes, preaches to the Ninevites, and the king proclaims a fast. He says, man and beast. And, of course, the message Jonah preached was what? Yeah, repent or perish. Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be destroyed. And the king says, man and beast, put sackcloth on them, fast, and we're going to beg. Who knows? Maybe, just maybe, God will change his mind, turn away from this punishment. And of course, here's another example. Like with Ahab, God did. Of course, unfortunately, like with Ahab, it was short-lived. And they were going to get themselves into trouble again later on. But fasting can put people in a better frame of mind to seek God, to seek God's will or his aid or his mercy. It can help to develop self-discipline. We began a couple weeks ago talking about the works of the flesh in Galatians 5. We'll eventually get to where we'll study the fruit of the Spirit, but that's what he talks about in Galatians. Is that you, Tim? Galatians 5, 22 and 23.
But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law.
And temperance would be the self-control aspect of that. And so one way you can help to develop self-control, temperance, is a fast. And again, as we talked about last week, this may be a fast from food. It may be a fast from something else. Maybe, some people take a fast from social media. Some people take a fast from television, whatever. But it can help to develop self-discipline. 1 Corinthians 9:27. Who had that one? Okay.
But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified.
He says, I discipline my body. King James, and I think ASV, no, it's ASV. The King James, I think, says, I keep under my body. ASV says, I buffet my body. Dave, brother Billy Bland used to tell us, he believes in what Paul said, I buffet my body daily. That's not buffet, that's buffet. Well, some of us in preaching school took a couple of years to learn that, But it's self-discipline. So that's a benefit of fasting. And also it helps us to put aside the temporal cares, things that we're thinking about of earthly importance, to concentrate more on spiritual things. Brother Mark, did you get the passage in Acts? Acts 13:3. Just verse 3 right now. All right, so they're getting ready, and well, let's go ahead and read those, and I'll comment on. It's going to go with something else we're going to mention. Let's go ahead and get verses 1 and 2. All right. I didn't realize there were all those names in there, Mark. I'd have given that one to Billy if I'd have realized that. But they've got, the Holy Spirit says, separate me, Barnabas and Paul, for this work. And so they fast and they pray and they lay hands on them, not in a miraculous sense here in this context. They're laying hands on them in the sense of commissioning them to go out and to do this missionary journey. And thus begins Paul's first missionary journey. But they're putting aside temporal cares to think about the importance of this journey that Paul and Barnabas are going to go on to take the Word of God and teach it to others. So that's another reason. We do see examples of fasting in the New Testament, and one of them is right here in Acts chapter 13 that Brother Mark just read there in verses 1 through 3. They were ministering to the Lord there in Antioch. And it mentions in verse 2 that they were fasting in that context. And then they fast again, or at least it's specifically mentioned that they fasted again when they send Paul and Barnabas out on this journey. It is also mentioned in connection with appointing elders. Brother Mark, you still in Acts 13? Grab 14:23 if you're still there. So they're appointing elders, they pray, they fast. I've seen congregations that would do this when they're appointing elders. They would ask the congregation, again, not binding it, not saying, hey, make sure you come and report to us that you fasted and how long, but just saying, hey, we would like to encourage our members. We're appointing, sometimes it's for the first time, sometimes it's an extra elder in addition to the ones that are there, but they may say, we would just like to encourage the congregation to pray about this and to engage in fasting and praying about this. They did in the New Testament, so you got New Testament precedent for that, certainly. And then 1 Corinthians 7, verse 5. Is that you, Blake? Brother Jimmy.
Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, to come together again, that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control.
So here in the context of a discussion about marriage and the marriage relationship, he says, don't defraud one another, don't withhold yourselves from one another, except in a situation where there's prayer and fasting, a set time, and it's to focus on spiritual matters. So there might be a fast from marital intimacy in order to focus on something spiritual. Again, it may be in the context of something going on with the congregation, or it may be something in the context of something going on personally. Blake, I realized I skipped your verse. I apologize. It was number 5 in my list of why one might choose to fast. I apologize for that, Blake. Number 5 in that list was fasting can help us to develop a greater appreciation for what we have. It's easy to get complacent and take things for granted. I'm having leftovers today. Well, there are a lot of people in the world that would just love to have what we call leftovers. And sometimes I get into that if I'm not careful. And, oh, I don't want to eat just a sandwich. Well, there are people in the world that would love to have just a sandwich or a few crackers or whatever, you know. So sometimes we take things for granted. Colossians 3:15.
Let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to the which also you are called from one body, and be ye thankful.
Be ye thankful. And sometimes, if you want to be thankful for something, just go a little bit without it. My wife helps me with this every once in a while. She'll take a girls' trip or something, and I think it's like she's wanting to help me to be more spiritual. It's a fast from having a mom at home, and believe me, it works, because I'm like, hey, all right. So, it helps you to appreciate what you got. If you want to know how much you appreciate your wife, your mom, anything, go a little bit of time without it, and you learn, hey, I'm very, very thankful. Sometimes I notice that, there's some of you in here that have been on mission trips and things like that, and I've never been in a situation. My buddy Brent has been to places where he's sleeping on dirt on a cot, something like that. He tells me that when he came home from his first trip to Cambodia, he said, I literally stepped off the plane, and when I actually crossed that threshold and I'm standing on LAX, the actual solid surface of LAX airport, he said, I dropped down and I literally kissed the floor. And I thought, you really were appreciative, I guess, if you did that at LAX. But, even going and the trips that I've been on, when I come back home, there's certain things that you can't get over there, you can't have over there. Poor old, where's Stephanie? She's not here tonight, but poor old Stephanie Hodges, she couldn't get her Diet Cokes down in Nicaragua, and I thought, what are we going to do with Stephanie? If she'd have stayed much longer, she'd just gone crazy. But sometimes a little bit of a fast makes us appreciate things, doesn't it? So those are some reasons why people might fast and some benefits of fasting. So again, not something we can just bind on somebody, but don't just gloss over that either and just read over it without thinking too much about it, because there is a lot of benefit there. Yes, sir.
Reading an article that a biologist wrote, and it's amazing how the Bible lines up with science for the good. God never tells us to do things that doesn't benefit us.
Yep.
So this biologist said that as the body starts to do without food, that it senses that it might be starving to death. So it instantly starts resetting the cells inside the body. And it says this reset then causes the cells to strengthen themselves. And it's fascinating when you think, here God is telling us to do something. And it's a reset, but then spiritually, what are you doing? You're resetting and focusing. So the body is doing what the spiritual side of man is doing. And for individuals that think, I'll pass on fasting, you might be giving up a blessing that God does with the body when we simply do what he does.
That's a good point. I meant to mention that, so I'm glad you brought it up, because I'd kind of forgotten that. But yeah, there are studies and things that show the physical benefits of fasting. It's good for you physically. You don't want to go into too long a fast without a doctor overseeing that or kind of helping you, whatever. But and you don't want to just start if you're used to eating a ton of food. You don't want to just boom, I'm going to go cold turkey fast. But it's something you kind of have to be smart about. But at the same time, there are lots of studies that show it's almost like a system reset when you get to a certain point of fasting, and there are a lot of health benefits from that. But spiritually, as you were saying, that's kind of what happens as well. It's sort of like a spiritual reset, and it helps us to focus. And there are a lot of good benefits from it. And I've kind of learned that ever since that answer I gave in Childersburg. I've studied that more, and particularly when I preached through the Sermon on the Mount here at Bremen, and I think it was 14 on into 2015. But it really helped me a lot to understand that a little bit better. Going into the next section here of Matthew chapter 6, really it goes about, we could break this into verses 19 through 24, I suppose. He's He's talked a lot about several different things, already: murder, adultery, divorce, oaths, loving our enemies, doing good deeds, prayer, fasting, money. And it's kind of interesting because sometimes you think about this. We're all about Jesus teaching people against murder because, we'd never murder anybody, right? We're all about Jesus teaching against adultery. We'd never do that. But we're not always so comfortable with Jesus talking about money, are we? Because, everybody's got some money. Some people, when it comes to treasure, they tend toward what sometimes people call a poverty theology. They think any money is bad, it's wrong. If you have any amount of money, if you're any kind of wealthy, you must be a bad person because money is just inherently wrong. That's not a biblical position. In fact, it would make pretty much every American impossible to go to heaven because compared to 90% of the world or so, even the poorest American is pretty wealthy. Some people tend toward prosperity theology. They act like money is the reward of the righteous. This is your Joel Osteen's. If you just pray right and if you just do enough and send enough to him, God's going to bless you in so many ways and it's just going to reward you with money, money, money. That's not biblical. God never promised that. Never, never, anywhere has he promised, if you serve me, I'll make sure you're really, really wealthy. That's utterly ridiculous. And for somebody to stand up and preach that is just it's blasphemous and it's deceitful. And then, of course, there's the proper theology. That's the idea of realizing that it all belongs to God and I'm just a steward. I'm just a steward. God has put me as a steward over maybe 5 talents. Some folks have 5 talents in the sense of a lot of money, a lot of wealth. Some folks may have 2 talents. Some folks may have 1. Everybody's got different amounts. And that's not what it's about. It's about what are you doing with what you have? What's your stewardship with what you have? That's the important thing. I love this quote I read, and I don't know where I read this, but it was from a preacher. And this preacher said this. He said, I've had people sit with tears in their eyes and say they've committed adultery, that they're addicted to something, or that they stole money. But he said, in all my years of preaching, I've never had a person brokenheartedly confess, I'm greedy. You think about that. I've preached for a little over 20 years. I'd have to say the same thing. Never had anybody confess that. I got a love of money, Brother Chad, and I need some prayers, need some strength, encouragement, help with that. Usually it's something we just think of, maybe that's somebody else. And so Jesus here is going to talk about in this section, in 19 through 21, he's going to talk about single treasure. Laying up treasure in heaven. Don't lay up treasure here on this earth. Moth and rust corrupts, thieves break through and steal. But lay up treasure in heaven. Nothing can corrupt it there. So he's going to talk about single treasure. And then when you get to verses 22 and 23, he's going to talk about single vision. And then verse 24 is dealing with single master. Can't serve 2 masters, right? So we talked about when he's mentioning single treasure, over and over again in the Bible, this is not just a New Testament concept, over and over again in the Bible you see that faith and finances are intertwined. They're inseparable. And it's because it's understanding that I'm a steward, that it all belongs to God. Everybody lays up treasure somewhere. Somewhere. The question is, of course, where am I laying up treasure? This earth is a very foolish investment. You've heard no doubt about the rich fellow that died, and somebody asked, well, how much did he leave behind? You know what the answer was? All of it. All of it. We say sometimes you can't take it with you, and it's kind of an old cliche, but do we stop and think about the truthfulness of that statement? I saw this illustration. There was a man who said that he shipwrecked on an island somewhere, out in the middle of nowhere, this South Sea island. And he's taken by the natives, hoisted to their shoulders, carried to the village, and they put him on this makeshift throne, and little by little he figured out it was their custom once each year to make a man king. And he's king for a year. And this fellow liked that pretty well, of course, until he began to wonder, well, if they do this once a year, where are all the other kings? So what he found out was that every year when the kingship ends, the king is banished to an island, a nearby island. It's just an empty island, and you know what happens is banished there all by himself. Eventually, especially after a year of pampering by the natives, he's going to starve to death. Well, this king was pretty smart, so you know what he did? He's the king, right? King for a year. So he sent carpenters over to this little island. And he starts having them to build him a nice palace. He sends farmers over there, transplanting fruit trees and vegetables and all kinds of things for him to eat. Farmers are transplanted over there to grow crops for the king. Masons are building houses and things. And so when the kingship is over, he was banished not to a deserted island, but to a fully furnished island. You see, he's not laying up treasure there. He's laying up treasure where he's going to be. And that's what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew 6, 19 through 21. The fellow says it's a good parable of life. We're all kings here, kings for a little while, able to choose what we shall do with the stuff of life. Are you going to end up eternally starving, or are you storing up treasures in heaven? And so Jesus says, lay your treasures up in heaven. Moth, rust, thieves corrupt here, and eventually the way of all the earth is death. Where's your treasure? And it's interesting here that he says treasure. This is about more than just money. He doesn't just say money here. He says treasure. Not everybody has money, but everybody has treasure, right? I mean, you may be poor, but there are things that you treasure. You may be broke as a joke, as Jacob likes to say. Broke as a convict. But you got treasure, right? Everybody has treasure. Where's your treasure? Your heart moves toward what you treasure. Jesus says treasure follows the heart, not vice versa. And so there's a need here for single treasure. And we got to watch out for the things that'll get our treasure in the wrong place. Sin in general, stuff, money, possessions, and so on, and self. Those are the things we got to watch out for, right? How do I lay up treasure in heaven? Somebody said there are 4 great deposits that you can make over and over and over laying up treasure. If you're at work and you've got a 401k, or maybe you've got an IRA or something like that, and you're contributing to it, right? Because one day you want to be able to draw that out, and draw it out with interest. And maybe you plan to retire and just live off of that. So you're constantly making deposits. You don't make one-time deposit, right? And say, well, we're set, honey. We put our $1,000 into the 401k. Can't wait till retirement. Well, I mean, it's going to multiply some, certainly, but not going to be what you need to live on. These are 4 deposits you can make over and over and over. Worship. Come together to worship God. That could be private worship. That could be worshiping together with the saints. But worship is a deposit we can make to lay up treasure in heaven. And you make it over and over and over. A Christ-like character, being crucified with Christ. The life you live in the flesh, live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me, gave himself for me. Galatians 2:20, Paul says. Over and over and over. That's something we can constantly work on, having a Christ-like character, and that's a deposit you can keep on making. Generosity, Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Generosity, helping others, benevolence, however you want to do that. Good deeds, alms, Jesus sometimes says, early part of Matthew chapter 6. But helping others, generosity toward others, that's a deposit you can make over and over and over. And it pays dividends, doesn't it? Leading others to Jesus is a deposit you can make over and over and over and lay up treasure in heaven. In fact, James says, let him know that he that converts a sinner from the error of his way shall save a soul from death And there's an added dividend, what? Cover a multitude of sins. He that winneth souls, the wise man says in Proverbs 11:30, is wise. So those are 4 deposits you can make to lay up treasure in heaven. And then he talks here again in verses 22 and 23 about single vision. I'm running out of time. I may want to talk about this a little bit more next week. But he says the light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? Here are some things that Roger says in his notes that I think kind of help summarize this. Maybe I think I can read this and get through it before we run out of time. Activities of the body typically are directed according to the light received through the eye. You walk, something is coming at you, you avoid it, whatever. It's all, you're processing things through the eye typically, right? If the eye is faulty, or if you're in darkness, you tend to stumble. You don't believe it, get into a totally dark room with stuff in the way, and you'll find out real quick. If you have children, you know what that's about, because who hadn't been there? You're walking through and you run into stuff. I mean, at this point, after 7, I've gotten kind of good at it, not in the sense of avoiding things, but I just creep through the house at such a snail's pace so that I can barely stick my foot out. So if I hit something, I'm not going to just break a toe on it. But you know how that is. You bump into stuff, you stumble over stuff. That's the idea here, the eye kind of directing things. At the very least, you're severely handicapped if there's a fault there. The single eye, or the good eye the New King James has, is a clean heart in this context, and it means that your whole body is full of light. It doesn't mean you're sinlessly perfect. It means you're striving to do what's right. It's a clean heart. The body's full of light. Having a good eye spiritually for investment here in this context. Sometimes people say, that fella, he's got a good eye for investment. Oh, so-and-so, he's got money. Well, he doesn't really, he's got a good job, but you wouldn't think he'd have that much money. Somebody says, well, but he's got a lot of investments. He's got a good eye for that. Well, Jesus here is talking about somebody with a good eye for investment, not in stocks and bonds and mutual funds, but in laying up treasure in heaven. And so that's kind of the idea here. You can have, as one fellow put it, spiritual cataracts in your eye. One spiritual cataract that sometimes people get is double vision. Well, what did Paul say? Colossians 3:1-2. If you then be risen with Christ, set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. Some people get double vision. They're trying to look at heaven and the earth at the same time, and boy, it's really going to affect you spiritually. You think you're going to function and have an easy time if you got double vision in your physical eyes? And then sometimes people get nearsighted. 2 Peter 1:9, Paul talks about that with the Christian graces in that context. If you don't do these things, you're blind, cannot see afar off. You're nearsighted spiritually, cannot see afar off. Can't see beyond the here and now, the tip of your nose, we sometimes say, to look toward the eternal future. And he says he's forgotten that he was purged from his old sins. And in verse 24, we can talk about that a little bit more next week. But he talks about here a single master. This is one of those familiar verses from Matthew chapter 6. No man can serve 2 masters. You know what Mark Twain said? He said he believed marriage should only be 1 man and 1 woman. You know why? Because the Lord said no man can serve 2 masters. On that note, we'll stop. Thank you very much.